right, hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our webinar on international travel to Arizona this year. Hopefully you all can hear me. If not, let me know in the chat function or the Q&A section, so I will try to fix it if we have any technical difficulties. All right, so some of you may have seen the U.S. travel webinar earlier this week, so I'm going to touch on a few of those points. But for the most part, I'm going to be focusing on market trends in Arizona by country. If I can get the slide to advance, we'll see. There we go. All right, so it has been kind of a weird year, or weird couple of years actually, for measuring international arrivals into the U.S. as a whole. So there's been some confusion about the number of international arrivals, and you may have heard quite a few theories about what's going on. Arrivals reported by the National Travel and Tourism Office were dropping at kind of alarming rates, which led to some speculation about a tourism slump and issues with international tourism due to the strong dollar. It's not a new problem, and a lot of it started with these. Customs and Border Protection introduced these automated passport control kiosks at international ports of entry. So for Americans returning from abroad and for visitors entering the U.S., the kiosks provided really great fast processing. So while they do streamline the customs process, the data on the arrivals that the kiosks collect were not necessarily categorized in a way that's useful for us as tourism marketers and analysts. So it's great for Customs and Border Protection. They got all the numbers they needed, but for us, it was just a little bit, it categorized it weirdly. So for the past few years, the National Travel and Tourism Office has questioned the data coming from CBP, and in April they decided to stop reporting international arrivals to the U.S. until they could resolve the problem. So it took several months, but now the issue is fixed. All right, so what does that mean for us? One thing I do want to mention is that that does not change the Arizona estimates of international arrivals. We use tourism economics to estimate our international visitor volume, and once the data started looking a little funny from the National Travel and Tourism Office, our vendor's tourism economics started weighting that less in the analysis. So we have no plans, at least at this point, to revise any of our historical numbers. So as far as we're concerned, those are still set. What this does mean for us for this international webinar is we don't quite have the data that we usually have when it comes to those international travelers. One of my favorite data sources is the Survey of International Air Travelers. It's a great source of profile information. So it talks about how Chinese visitors plan and book their Arizona trips, how the French who visit Arizona tend to visit 5 or more states on the same trip, and also more of the demographic information. So I got that data yesterday. So I haven't had time to process and digest and synthesize yet. So that will be coming later. So like I said, today I'm going to focus more on overall trends. Did I miss a slide? Where'd it go? All right. So just to recap, the data that we do have today is visitation and spending estimates in Arizona by Tourism Economics. This is actually, we have a lot more data than we've ever had from Tourism Economics, and it's really fun because a lot of it has to do with competitive data. So we're able to compare ourselves to any other state and say, okay, so we lost visitation from this country. Did that happen with other states as well, or are we unique? So that's been really fun to play with. We also have that updated I-94 data from NTTO, and we have Visa card spending data. All right, so let's get into it and get into visitation trends. So for the past 10 years, we've seen some ups and downs in international visitation. We saw a pretty big fall off in 2008 and 2009 during the recession. The recovery took a few years, and in 2015, we hit a peak of 5.7 million visits. For the past couple of years, we've seen decreased international visitation again, and we'll get into the details of that in a little bit. There have been a few reasons for this gradual decline. The strong dollar will always present challenges when the euro is struggling. And when we talk about international visits to Arizona, Mexico is going to be the dominant player. Changes in Mexican and Canadian visitation are going to set the overall trend for the state. All right, and like I said, no other country even comes close to the number of visitors that come from Mexico. Mexico made up 65% of our international visitation last year, so when you see this downtrend in the gray line, that makes a huge difference in our numbers. I mentioned this at GCOT, but the loss in visitation from Mexico is equivalent to a scenario in which all of Germany and a good chunk of the UK just didn't come at all. You can also see there was a little bit of a softening among Canadian visitors in orange the past few years, but thankfully we've started to see increases again last year. But that exchange rate really put a dent in our Canadian visitation, or at least the spending. Canada has shown to be a little, somewhat of a price-sensitive market, so changes in the exchange rate do have an impact, and also the price of oil is going to be a big factor for energy-producing provinces like Alberta. And Alberta is probably our key. I think they produce about a third of our visitors. So gas prices were at some historic lows in 2015 and 16, so it's great for most travelers, not great for those employed in the energy sector. Here's another way to visualize it. I went for bubbles this year, just to get a sense of how much Mexico dwarfs other countries in terms of visitation. Canada coming in second, and then our top three overseas markets of Germany, the UK, and France are pretty similar in volume, but China's starting to catch up. And I also think it's really important to put our visitation trends in a broader context. So for the next two slides, we're going to look at trends compared to the U.S. as a whole. And our visitation pattern doesn't always mirror what's going on in the U.S. The U.S. saw a much bigger drop in 2016 than we did, but while they bounced back in 2017, our loss got bigger. And again, a really big part of that has to do with our visitation from Mexico. Here's an idea of the scale of each market by world region. Again, we have those three big players in Europe. They're not labeled, but it's France, Germany, and the UK. And it's more evenly spread in Asia Pacific than you might think among Japan, China, South Korea, and I've added Australia in there. I've also put South America and other in there. Really, there's just two countries of notice, Brazil and Argentina. They're pretty small in terms of visitation. Other is going to be the Middle East, such as Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and so on. So whether each bubble grew or shrank last year varies a lot by country, and since this is a lot to look at, and these slides will be available later if you want to take your time with them, I'm going to break it down by world region. So we have the U.S., this is the percent change by country of origin, so this is how much growth or loss in visitation compared to the previous year. So we're in green, the U.S. is in orange. All right, Germany was our top overseas market in 2017, and our secondary European markets, at least in terms of visits, are Switzerland, Spain, and Italy, and the United Kingdom. So here I've pulled out the trend line for just our top European markets and their visitation trends since 2007. So these markets have had their ups and downs, but overall the trend is really stable. We haven't quite been able to reach our prior peaks of in 2008, but I really think that had a lot to do with exchange rates. Back in 2008, our €1 bought almost $1.50, so it had huge purchasing power compared to the $1.19 it buys today. And I think this pattern is pretty typical of stable economies like those in Europe. Demand rises and falls a bit, but overall the trend is much flatter than countries who have seen dramatic shifts in their economies. All right, so among the European countries, visitation to Arizona broadly followed trends at the national level. So we did see much faster growth in Spanish visitation, which is interesting to look at. So we'll keep an eye on Spain. Our numbers from Spain are pretty small at this point, but if over the next few years we get a larger and larger share of the market, that's going to signal us to put more efforts there. Arizona is a secondary destination for a lot of Europeans, so last year British travel to Arizona dropped about 7%, which is a lot more than it dropped to the U.S. And with a lot of countries, if the dollar is slowing demand for U.S. travel, secondary destinations like ours can be trimmed from the itinerary. So we really rely on strong demand for the U.S., and probably that's one of the most compelling reasons for partnering with and supporting Brand USA. We need that strong demand for the U.S. to make sure people are visiting these secondary destinations. However, France and Germany are a little bit different. For both of these markets, just in the nature of the way they travel, they tend to visit lots of states in one trip. I think the last time I looked at it for France, 80% of French visitors to Arizona also visited California and Utah. So multi-state itineraries, that's just the way they travel. So we're probably going to track a little more closely with U.S. trends in that way. Both of these markets were only up by 2% or less, and so we're keeping an eye on those because they are two of our key markets. Moving on to the Asia-Pacific region, we have 4 major players. Japan and South Korea are slightly more mature markets, clearly have invested a lot in China, and Australian visitation to Arizona is really strong. So here we have the overall trend among those emerging markets, and emerging is sort of a loose term I'm using here. Like I said, it's mostly Asia-Pacific, but I added Brazil in here because it made sense to talk about it, and overall South America as a region isn't a big one for Arizona yet. So at least not for the purposes of this webinar today, we're lumping Brazil in with the emerging markets. And as you can see, this shows a really different picture compared to Europe. There, the trend was pretty stable, but here we have some consistent growth depending on the country, and in some cases, like China, extremely rapid growth. So Australian visitation is up 35% since 2012, and South Korea is up 58%. So those markets are really clipping along at a good pace. And of course, China's growth has been extraordinary. Visitation to Arizona from China has increased 162% since 2012. I checked that number a few times, so yes, it's true. And it does make a difference that we started from a low base of only about 15,000 visitors in 2007. But it really is amazing to see this level of growth. And it has moderated over the last year. So I think last year we grew about 6%, whereas we had been spoiled and we were getting 20%, 15% growth year over year. But still, lots and lots of growth. And China just keeps leapfrogging over other countries in terms of the ranking. I also like to point out that we began our trade and media representation in China in 2013, so it turned out to be pretty well timed. As a researcher, I love to see a sharp upward bend anytime we do something to try to influence a market. So I can't say for sure that it was because we have representation, but I do think that makes a big difference when we do have a presence and are actively talking to this market, that the pace of visitation to Arizona really jumped up fast. And there's other factors too. I think the 10-year visa came about around this time too. But I'm happy that we're in the market because it was clearly one that was ready to take off. Just a quick note about Brazil. AOT hired trade and media representation in Brazil in 2013 after seeing all this growth that had been happening. And we did see a pretty good jump in 2014. However, by 2015, visitation had slowed down again, and we were noticing that Brazilians really heavily favor beach destinations, and I'll talk about that again in a little bit. And the economy in Brazil was about to have some struggles. So we ended our contract with Brazil in 2015. We'll always watch this market, and if it makes sense to go back in, we will. But for now, it seems like our efforts, at least at the state level, are better concentrated elsewhere. We did have a pretty good year in terms of growth from the Asia-Pacific region. Like I said, we've gotten used to an insane amount of year-over-year growth from China, which has been in the double digits for the past few years. So when it only grew 6% in 2017, we were a little bit disappointed. But when we compare ourselves to the U.S. as a destination, we still outperform the U.S. in growth from Chinese visitors. We were also able to buck the trend in Australia and grew visitation in Japan by 10%. Japanese visitation to the U.S. was totally flat in 2017, so that's why you don't actually, oh, you actually can see, you may be able to see that tiny little sliver of orange, but it was flat to a tiny bit negative, but we did really well, so it's nice to buck the trend. All right, so some of you may have watched that U.S. travel webinar earlier this week or heard this at ESTO. One of the ways we at AOT evaluate how competitive we are in the travel space is to consider our share of the market. So for the U.S., international arrivals were up in 2017, and it's all well and good, but if we aren't growing as fast or faster than our competitors, then we're losing out on visitation and spending. So just a quick recap at the national level. For the U.S., like I said, up 2%, but in 2017, global long-haul travel grew by 9%. So because the pie got bigger and our piece of it didn't, or our piece of it got smaller. So that's something we have to watch out for. We don't want to be slipping in market share. All right, now in terms of Arizona's share of U.S. visitation, so now we're talking about the pie is the U.S. travel, and this is Arizona's slice of it. This is what it's looked like for the last 10 years or so. So we peaked in 2017 at a little over 6%, and right now we're resting at about 5.17%. So we haven't quite gotten back to our pre-recession market share, but we will get there. All right, this slide, I really tried 3 times to remove some of the states, but the PowerPoint gremlins kept changing it overnight, so we're just going to leave it as it is. But I did notice that a lot of the plain states stayed flat this year in terms of change in market share. Who gained a bigger share of the pie, who lost it? And only a handful of U.S. states lost market share in 2017. And if you look at it, there seems to be a pretty common thread. So Nevada, Texas, Arizona, and California. I dug into it, and there is a big difference. Mexico is the main difference. A lot of the states that lost overall market share had big drops in Mexican visitation. On the other hand, the states with big increases, major gateways, you see Florida and New York right there, and not as dependent on Mexican visitation. Florida had huge gains from Brazil and Argentina, and they had much better performance among European countries, with the exception of the UK. So the hit that they took from Mexico was more than compensated for by Brazil and Argentina, and I'm talking like by a lot. New York actually had a 4% increase from Mexico and a 10% increase from China, but even they lost visitation from the UK in 2017. And Washington also doesn't have nearly the Mexican visitation of other states, and their key markets in South Korea, China, and Canada had some really solid gains. So the number of visitors is one thing, but as we evolve as DMOs, the next question has to take a more holistic approach, and we look at spending as well as visitation volume. And this conversation becomes more and more important as sites start to become overwhelmed by the number of tourists. So now we're going to look at the visitors that contribute the most spending. All right, we're back to my bubbles, but this time I've got the number of visitors by region up top, and then the spending on the bottom. So the first thing you notice is that in terms of spending, Canada and Mexico are much more equal. But here's where I have a little bit of hesitation. So this is from Tourism Economics, and it is really difficult for any company to get good spending data for Mexico. I'm not sure how well this data set accounts for day visitor spending, so keep that in the back of your mind as we look at this. But Canadian spending in Arizona is a different animal as well. It likely doesn't include a lot of spending by snowbirds for things that aren't considered typical tourism spending, for example, home maintenance, health care, and all of those things, property taxes, all of those things that our Canadian snowbirds will spend on. But what is clear, in terms of short-term leisure visitors, the old adage about overseas visitors staying longer and spending more holds pretty true. The farther away they go, the more they tend to spend per person. While the number of people visiting from Asia Pacific is pretty small, their spending rivals Europe, and it's really concentrated among a few countries. So it's a little hard to tell here, but China spends more than any other overseas market. So it looks small in the bubble, but they are outspending any European market right now. Like I said earlier, the gray other categories comprise mostly of Middle Eastern countries like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. So not so terribly surprising from those countries. that the few visitors who do make it here from the Middle East tend to spend a lot per person. And then here we've got spending per visitor, and there's some very clear winners. So China spends, in Arizona at least, spends almost $3,000 per person. India also has a huge spending per person. Those numbers are still pretty low, but like Brand USA, we're keeping an eye on this market. Brand USA is all in for India. I think for Arizona, we've got a little bit of ways to go. It tends to be a more business travel market for us, but we're going to keep a close watch on it. And this is where the Mexican spending is really very different from most of the international visitors. It's a lot lower, so there's lots of high volume of people, not quite as much spending per person. All right, so the next few slides are going to cover insights from our data from VisaView. Excuse me. So with any data source, it's really important to know the limitations before acting on the information. Visa data is a really great tool to get information about actual transactions. A lot of spending data comes from asking people how much they spent, and I don't know about you, but I can only give ballpark guesses as to how much I spent at restaurants on my last trip. Overseas visitors are often also not entirely aware of what state they're in while they're spending. So it's tricky to know if the spending that they report actually happened in Arizona, or maybe it was Nevada or California. So Visa data offers this concrete spending that actually happened in Arizona. So a few caveats while we go. It tends to be volatile because it's a lot smaller sample, and not every country uses Visa cards in the same way. India and Mexico, for example, tend to rely much more heavily on cash, and with China, the more vendors start to accept mobile payment systems, this number could change. Just a quick chart, this hideous and full of too many colors, but I wanted to point out just how competitive the landscape is in the U.S. for international spending. So Arizona is number 10 for Visa card spending among the states, and we hold about 2% of all Visa card spending in the U.S., and this is from 2017. All right, so for the next few slides, I'm going to just go over these really quickly. It's the percentage of their Visa card spending and how it's spent based on merchant category. All right, so in Australia, we can see there's this really big chunk for lodging, and then other retail is next. Other retail breaks down to gift card and novelty stores, miscellaneous food stores. I interpret this as maybe sort of specialty food stores like Queen Creek Olive Mill or those types of places, shoe stores and jewelry. They actually had quite a bit of spending, too, in other travel and entertainment, and that's a lot of RV rentals, tourist attraction, and golf courses. I think Australia is probably one of the markets that had the best spending in golf, so if you are in a destination with a lot of golf courses, they might be a good market for you. Canada has a different look to it. They start with retail. Lodging is a much smaller piece of it, and their spending is very evenly distributed for the first little bit, so between other retail, lodging, restaurants, supermarkets. They're an interesting mix of transactions that say short-term visitor and also snowbird. Lots of spending in wholesale clubs like Costco, and also a pretty good amount of spending in auto rental too. So other travel and entertainment, golf courses was the top for this one. Trailer parks and campgrounds, tourist attraction, recreation services, and of course motorhome and RV rentals. In the other retail, the very top one was home supply warehouse stores. So that gives you an idea of some of the things that Canadians are spending money on while they're here. And also car and truck dealers. There weren't a lot of transactions in car dealerships, but obviously big ticket item that gets bumped up in the rankings. So, and this year was an oddly big one for big ticket purchases by Canadians. All right. Something to think about for China is embrace the bling. There was a huge amount of spending in women's accessories and jewelry in particular. In accessories, the average purchase was $250, but in jewelry stores where there were fewer transactions, but the average purchase was more than $1,000. So that was pretty cool to see. Other travel and entertainment makes up a little bit of a smaller share for Chinese visitors, but they go to tourist attractions, they rent RVs, so lots of good spending from China. France is a country where we really have some pretty typical tourist spending. You know, probably one of the largest shares of their spending goes to lodging. Other retail tends to be souvenirs, shoes, miscellaneous food stores, clothing. Other travel and entertainment is RV rentals, boat rentals, and that makes a lot of sense, especially the boat rentals. French visitors tend to be most likely to visit northern Arizona, so around Lake Powell. All right, Germany. This is the first place I've seen that prioritizes men's clothing over women's, so I thought that was interesting. Might indicate that German travel parties have more men than other countries. They spend a pretty good amount on lodging and other retail, but they have one of the biggest shares of other travel and entertainment, and that includes RV rentals, tourist attractions. They're renting boats too, and they're spending time in trailer parks and campgrounds. And for those of us that work actively with Germany, you know, we know that they like to travel around. They're more likely to go south, and so the trailer parks and campgrounds and RV rentals is no big surprise. All right, for Japan, really big share on lodging, pretty big share on other retail too, and lots of souvenirs. Jewelry was a big one again, and clothing. Other travel and entertainment was tourist attractions. They're renting RVs as well, recreation services, and they do play golf too. But you can see the other travel and entertainment is kind of small up there at 3%. There's lots of other things that get prioritized first. All right, Mexico is a familiar story to us too. Lots and lots of retail, so much clothing. That's going to make up by far the most spending. And unlike a lot of other international markets, you see that other retail is the first one, then supermarkets, then discount stores, then department stores, and then lodging only makes up about 6%. So heavy on the retail. All right, and the UK, again, is a little more like your typical overseas long-haul visitor with lodging at 35%. Other retail is lots of gift cards, novelty stores, food stores, shoes, clothes. Other travel and entertainment is not it's a pretty big size piece of the pie. And RV rentals, tourist attractions, there tends to be, other travel and entertainment tends to be a big chunk if they included an RV. So lots of road trippers out there. All right, and to wrap things up, now we've got the first 3 quarters of visa data for 2018. So we're keeping an eye on each country. So like I said, this data tends to be pretty volatile, so we don't want to take huge swing, or things are going to swing up and down quite a bit. What we do look for are the trends. So it looks like Australia has been pretty positive for the first 3 quarters. I am a little bit concerned about that drop in Canadian spending in Q3, so we'll be digging into that a little bit. Q3 is not a huge time of year for Canadians, so it could just be that it was a small amount of spending to begin with, and that's why the percentage is so big. The UK dropped very minimally in Q1 compared to last year, but otherwise it's had some pretty good growth. So, you know, even though we lost visitation last year, we're looking okay right now in terms of spending at least. Italy's been an interesting story. You can see like 4% growth in Q1, 27% growth, and this is quarter over quarter, so this is comparing to the last quarter, the same quarter in 2017. But boy, 2018, 260% growth. I haven't dug into it to see if that's, you know, like a handful of people who are just purchasing really big ticket items, or if it's just a lot more card holders in the market. So it's definitely a signal to us to dig into it a little bit and keep watching. And the other thing I was happy to see is pretty solid increases in spending from Mexico. So up 33% in Q1. Q2 was a little bit flat, but Q3 is pretty good at 23%. And it'll really be important to keep an eye on Q4 when all of that holiday shopping is occurring. We want big, healthy increases. So yeah, overall total international visa card spending has been positive in all 3 quarters so far in 2018. All right, so unfortunately I didn't have all of that profile data. Like I said, I got it yesterday, so we'll be updating the market profile sheets that's under Visitation. So keep an eye out for those. Those will probably be posted in the next week. And we also have last year's presentation. So if you go to Research and Statistics, click on Market Research, it'll be down there. The way the Survey of International Air Travelers works is they tend to combine several years of sample data. So I don't anticipate major changes between last year's presentation and this year's. There might be. We're looking at some new countries this year, but if you really, really need profile data, this is probably going to be pretty good still. So that's there. And also, if you want to get more into visa spending, you can always check out Kari's regional webinars. She dug into visa a little bit more and looked at it in some different ways. I will say these are, I forget sometimes how to get to this page, so there's a drop-down menu under Research and Statistics. Don't click on anything on the drop-down, just click on Research and Statistics, and you'll see all of these, and they're all up there along with her notes. So those are really great resources if you haven't seen those yet. All right, so that wraps up our trends version of the international data. So I will be digging through the Survey of International Air Travelers, and if there's anything really amazing, I will be sure to share it with you. These slides, there will be a link to these slides in Tourism Tuesday next week. So if you haven't signed up, go to tourism.az.gov and sign up on the homepage. And now, if there are any questions, feel free to type them into the Q&A function or in the chat function. All right, well, thank you everyone for joining. If you're heading out to World Travel Market, safe travels and have a great weekend.